What really happened to the Neanderthals? The truth scientists finally discovered. If you think the Neanderthals disappeared 40,000 years ago, modern science has a surprise for you. For more than a century, history books told a simple story. A primitive human species wandered across Ice Age Europe until modern humans arrived. Unable to compete, they vanished forever, leaving behind only a few skulls buried in caves and a reputation as clumsy, dim-witted cavemen. It was a story so widely accepted that calling someone a Neanderthal became another way of calling them unintelligent. But what if almost every part of that story is wrong? What if the Neanderthals were never the failures we imagined? And what if the greatest discovery about them wasn't found in an ancient cave, but inside the DNA of millions, perhaps even billions of people alive today? Over the past few decades, archaeologists, geneticists, and paleoanthropologists have uncovered evidence that has forced the scientific community to rewrite one of the biggest chapters in human history. The result is not just a new understanding of the Neanderthals. It is a new understanding of ourselves. Our story begins in the summer of 1856 in a small limestone valley near Düsseldorf, Germany. Quarry workers were removing rock from a cave when they noticed several unusual bones embedded in the sediment. At first glance, nothing about the discovery seemed extraordinary. Human remains had been found before. But these bones were different. The skull was long and low, with heavy brow ridges unlike those of any modern person. The limbs were unusually robust, suggesting an individual of exceptional strength. Some experts insisted the skeleton belonged to a diseased soldier. Others believed it was simply an oddly shaped modern human. The idea that it represented another kind of human seemed almost impossible. Yet as more fossils emerged from caves across France, Belgium, Croatia, Spain, Iraq, and Israel, the evidence became impossible to ignore. These remains belonged to an ancient population that had once flourished across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They became known as the Neanderthals, named after the valley where the first recognized specimen had been discovered. The timing of the discovery was remarkable. Only 3 years later, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, transforming the world's understanding of evolution. Suddenly, those mysterious bones from Germany were no longer an archaeological curiosity. They became part of a much larger story about where humans came from and how different human populations had evolved. But early interpretations were shaped as much by Victorian assumptions as by scientific evidence. Because Neanderthals had thick bones, broad faces, and powerful bodies, they were portrayed as crude, stooped creatures driven mainly by instinct. Museum displays exaggerated their posture. Artists drew them dragging clubs through frozen landscapes, and popular culture embraced the image of the brutish caveman. That stereotype proved remarkably difficult to erase. For generations, it influenced everything from textbooks to films, despite being based on very limited evidence. The irony is that the fossils themselves never claimed Neanderthals were unintelligent. It was people who reached that conclusion. As archaeologists uncovered more sites throughout the 20th century, the stereotype began to fall apart. Stone tools became increasingly sophisticated. Ancient fireplaces showed controlled use of fire. Animal bones revealed organized hunting rather than random scavenging. Excavations uncovered evidence that Neanderthals repeatedly occupied the same locations, suggesting they understood seasonal migrations and returned to productive hunting grounds year after year. Instead of isolated individuals barely surviving, researchers began seeing organized communities capable of adapting to some of the harshest environments on Earth. That raised a troubling question. If Neanderthals were far more capable than scientists had assumed, why had they disappeared? For decades, researchers searched for the answer in caves, fossils, and stone tools. Some argued that modern humans were simply more intelligent. Others believed climate change had destroyed Neanderthal habitats. Still, others proposed disease, violent conflict, or simple bad luck. Every explanation seemed plausible, yet none fully explained the evidence. The more scientists learned about Neanderthals, the less convincing the traditional story became. Instead of solving the mystery, each discovery only deepened it. Around the same time, another scientific revolution was quietly beginning. Rather than searching for answers in bones alone, researchers started investigating something hidden inside those bones: tiny fragments of ancient DNA. Most experts believed the idea was hopeless. DNA begins breaking down almost immediately after death. Heat, moisture, bacteria, and time destroy it molecule by molecule. Recovering usable genetic material from remains tens of thousands of years old seemed almost impossible. But if it could be done, those fragile genetic fragments might answer questions that archaeology alone never could. They might reveal not only who the Neanderthals were, but how closely they were related to us. If you enjoy documentaries that separate established scientific evidence from popular myths while exploring archaeology, ancient civilizations, and the biggest mysteries of human history, consider subscribing to Unknown Discoveries. Every episode is built on the latest research, uncovering discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of the past. Because the deeper scientists looked into the story of the Neanderthals, the clearer it became that the greatest surprise was still waiting to be discovered. Everything people thought they knew about the Neanderthals was about to change, not because of a new fossil, but because of a breakthrough that would reveal a connection between them and every generation that followed. Imagine standing in Europe 100,000 years ago. There are no cities, no roads, no farms, and no written language. Vast glaciers dominate the northern horizon, while endless grasslands stretch across the south. Herds of woolly mammoths, bison, giant deer, wild horses, and woolly rhinoceroses roam the landscape. Cave lions, hyenas, and enormous bears compete for territory. Winter temperatures can plunge far below freezing, and survival depends on intelligence as much as strength. This was not a world built for humans. Yet for hundreds of thousands of years, one human population mastered it. The Neanderthals were remarkably well adapted to Ice Age Europe. Their bodies were shorter and more heavily built than those of most modern humans, with broad chests, powerful shoulders, and thick limbs that helped conserve heat in bitterly cold climates. Early scientists interpreted these features as signs of primitiveness, but today, researchers recognize them as sophisticated evolutionary adaptations. Nature had shaped Neanderthals specifically for the environments they inhabited. They were not poorly designed versions of us. They were perfectly designed for their world. Strength alone, however, cannot explain their success. Hunting an adult mammoth or steppe bison with nothing more than wooden spears required planning that few modern people can truly imagine. A single mistake could mean death. Archaeological sites across Europe show evidence of coordinated hunting strategies, suggesting groups worked together to surround, trap, and kill enormous animals. Such hunts demanded communication, trust, and careful timing. These were not desperate individuals acting on instinct. They were organized communities, capable of solving complex problems under extraordinary pressure. The same picture emerges from the tools they left behind. Rather than randomly striking stones together, Neanderthals developed sophisticated manufacturing techniques that archaeologists now refer to as the Mousterian tradition. Before the first blow was ever struck, the maker had to visualize the finished tool inside the stone itself. Each strike removed carefully planned flakes to create sharp cutting edges used for butchering animals, shaping wood, scraping hides, and preparing food. Modern experimental archaeologists who attempt to recreate these tools often discover that mastering the technique requires years of practice. It is skilled craftsmanship, not primitive improvisation. Even more surprising is growing evidence that Neanderthals understood processes once thought unique to modern humans. At several archaeological sites, researchers have found traces of birch bark tar used as an adhesive to attach stone points to wooden handles. Producing this tar required heating birch bark under controlled conditions with limited oxygen, something that cannot happen by accident. It suggests an understanding of fire and material properties that involves planning, experimentation, and the ability to repeat a complex process successfully. That kind of innovation challenges the long-standing assumption that advanced problem-solving belonged exclusively to Homo sapiens. Yet perhaps the strongest evidence against the old stereotype comes not from tools, but from compassion. One of the most famous discoveries was made at Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq. There, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an older Neanderthal man who had suffered catastrophic injuries during his lifetime. He had lost the use of one arm, experienced severe damage to one eye, and lived with multiple healed fractures. Despite these disabilities, he survived for many years after the injuries occurred. In the unforgiving conditions of the Ice Age, someone with such limitations could not have hunted large animals or defended themselves effectively. The only reasonable conclusion is that others cared for him. His community must have shared food, offered protection, and ensured his survival long after he could no longer contribute in the same way as everyone else. That discovery transformed how scientists viewed Neanderthal society. Compassion, cooperation, and social responsibility were no longer seen as uniquely modern human traits. Similar evidence from other archaeological sites has strengthened the idea that caring for vulnerable members was not an isolated event but an iron-bitten, established part of Neanderthal life. Researchers have also begun questioning another long-held assumption that Neanderthals lacked language. No recording of their voices exists, and no scientists can claim with certainty how they communicated. However, several lines of evidence suggest they possessed many of the biological foundations required for speech. The structure of the Neanderthal hyoid bone closely resembles that of modern humans, and genetic studies indicate they carried a version of the FOXP2 gene associated with speech and language. While this does not prove they spoke exactly as we do today, it strongly suggests they were capable of complex vocal communication, something that would have been essential for coordinating dangerous hunts, teaching skills, and maintaining social relationships. Then came another remarkable surprise. In caves across Spain, archaeologists discovered red pigments, engraved markings, and symbolic designs dating back more than 60,000 years. Some of these appear to have been created before modern humans reached the region. If those interpretations are correct and researchers continue to study the evidence, they suggest Neanderthals may have engaged in symbolic behavior long before it was traditionally attributed to our own species. Eagle talons, found in Croatia, appear to have been deliberately modified and possibly worn as ornaments, while pigments may have been used for decoration or ritual purposes. Scientists continue debating the exact meaning of these discoveries, but few now dismiss Neanderthals as incapable of symbolic thought. Piece by piece, the old image collapsed. The slow-witted caveman of 19th-century illustrations gave way to something entirely different. An intelligent human population that hunted cooperatively, mastered fire, manufactured sophisticated tools, cared for injured companions, adapted to brutal climates, and may even have expressed symbolic ideas. Far from being evolutionary failures, Neanderthals had survived across Europe and Western Asia for nearly 400,000 years, far longer than modern civilization has existed. And that realization created an even greater mystery. If they were this intelligent, if they were this adaptable, if they had already survived countless ice ages before modern humans ever arrived, then why did they disappear? For decades, archaeologists searched for the answer in caves and fossils, but the greatest breakthrough would come from an entirely different field of science. Hidden inside ancient bones was evidence so extraordinary that it would overturn one of the biggest assumptions in the history of human evolution. It would reveal that the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans was nothing like scientists had imagined, and that the story of their disappearance was only half the truth. Around 60,000 years ago, another chapter in human history began unfolding thousands of kilometers away. In Africa, Homo sapiens had already existed for hundreds of thousands of years, evolving their own cultures, technologies, and ways of surviving. Then, slowly, small groups began leaving the continent. They followed coastlines, crossed deserts, moved through river valleys, and expanded into the Middle East before gradually spreading across Europe and Asia. For generations, this migration was described as humanity's great triumph. Modern humans arrived, encountered the Neanderthals, outcompeted them, and replaced them. It was a simple story. Too simple, as it turns out. For nearly 10,000 years, these two human populations shared parts of the same world. Europe was no longer home to a single kind of human. Two intelligent populations hunted the same animals, crossed the same valleys, sheltered in many of the same caves, and watched the same Ice Age sunsets. Imagine standing on a windswept plain in what is now southern France 45,000 years ago. A small group of Neanderthal hunters tracks a herd of reindeer across frozen ground. Several kilometers away, another hunting party is moving toward the same valley. They are Homo sapiens. Neither group knows that tens of thousands of years later, scientists will still be asking one of history's greatest questions: what happened when they finally met? The honest answer is that we still do not know every detail. There are no written records, no eyewitness accounts, and no surviving traditions that describe those encounters. Everything scientists know has been reconstructed from archaeology, genetics, climate records, and fossil evidence. But one thing has become increasingly clear. The relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans was far more complicated than a simple battle for survival. Competition almost certainly existed. Both groups depended on many of the same animals for food. During periods of extreme cold, resources became scarce, forcing populations into smaller regions where hunting grounds overlapped. Two highly skilled hunting communities competing for the same herds would inevitably place pressure on one another. Yet competition does not automatically mean war. For many years, popular documentaries imagined dramatic battles between Neanderthals and modern humans, but archaeological evidence for large-scale conflict remains surprisingly limited. Individual skeletons show injuries, but those wounds could just as easily have come from dangerous hunts, accidents, or conflicts within their own communities. At present, there is no convincing evidence that Neanderthals disappeared because of a continent-wide war with Homo sapiens. Instead, researchers believe the answer may lie in a combination of smaller advantages that accumulated over many generations. Evidence suggests that Homo sapiens often lived in larger, more interconnected social networks. Ideas, technologies, and resources could spread across greater distances as groups exchanged knowledge with one another. A new hunting technique discovered hundreds of kilometers away might eventually reach communities that had never met the original inventor. This flow of information created what anthropologists call cumulative culture, where each generation builds upon the discoveries of the last. Even if Neanderthals were equally intelligent, smaller and more isolated populations may have struggled to innovate at the same pace. Climate added another layer of pressure. Europe during the final ice age was anything but stable. Temperatures rose and fell dramatically over relatively short periods. Forests expanded before giving way once again to open grasslands. Rivers changed course. Animal migration shifted. Habitats that had supported Neanderthal communities for thousands of years sometimes disappeared within only a few generations. They had survived many previous climate changes, but now those environmental challenges coincided with the arrival of another highly adaptable human population. Most scientists today believe that no single event sealed the Neanderthals' fate. Instead, multiple pressures slowly combined until recovery became increasingly difficult. Another possibility involves disease. Throughout history, when previously isolated populations have come into contact, they have often exchanged more than ideas and technology. They have also exchanged pathogens. The devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous peoples in the Americas after the 15th century demonstrates how vulnerable populations can be to unfamiliar illnesses. Some researchers have suggested that similar processes may have affected Neanderthals after contact with Homo sapiens. However, it is important to distinguish evidence from speculation. At present, there is no direct proof that disease played a decisive role. It remains one hypothesis among several, and scientists continue investigating it. For decades, none of these explanations completely satisfied researchers. Climate made sense, but Neanderthals had survived earlier climate swings. Competition seemed plausible, but it did not explain everything. Disease remained unproven. Archaeology had taken scientists as far as it could. The breakthrough came from an entirely different direction. Instead of studying stone tools or fossilized bones, researchers began searching for something hidden inside the bones themselves. Ancient DNA had long been considered impossible to recover. After an organism dies, its genetic material begins breaking apart almost immediately. Water, oxygen, bacteria, and time gradually reduced DNA to tiny fragments. Recovering meaningful genetic information from remains that were tens of thousands of years old seemed almost beyond belief. One scientist refused to accept that it was impossible. Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo spent years developing techniques capable of extracting and analyzing ancient DNA while preventing contamination from modern human genetic material. It was painstaking work. Laboratories had to be kept extraordinarily clean because a single skin cell from a researcher could contaminate an entire sample. Many attempts failed. But gradually, technology improved, and fragments of Neanderthal DNA began revealing their secrets. Researchers expected the genetic evidence to answer one straightforward question: how closely related were Neanderthals to modern humans? Instead, it answered a question that almost nobody had asked. When scientists compared Neanderthal DNA with the genomes of living people around the world, they discovered something extraordinary. People whose ancestry lies primarily outside Africa consistently carried small amounts of Neanderthal DNA: Europeans, East Asians, South Asians, Native Americans, indigenous Australians. Across these populations, roughly 1 to 2% of the genome could be traced directly to Neanderthal ancestors. The conclusion was unavoidable. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had not simply crossed paths. They had children together. Everything scientists believed about their relationship changed almost overnight. The old image of one species replacing another could no longer explain the evidence. These two human populations had formed families. They had shared not only landscapes but generations. The descendants of those unions survived, and tens of thousands of years later, their genetic inheritance still exists inside millions of people across the globe. Suddenly, the question was no longer, why did the Neanderthals disappear? It became something far more profound. If part of the Neanderthal population lives on inside us, did they ever truly disappear at all? For decades, the idea that modern humans carried Neanderthal DNA sounded like science fiction. If someone had suggested it in the 1980s, most experts would have dismissed it outright. Neanderthals were believed to be an evolutionary dead end, a separate branch of humanity that disappeared without leaving descendants. Yet science has a way of overturning even its most confident assumptions. In 2010, after years of painstaking research, the first draft of the Neanderthal genome was published. It instantly became one of the most important discoveries in the history of anthropology. The results were astonishing. When researchers compared Neanderthal DNA with the genomes of living people, they found clear evidence that individuals whose ancestry lies primarily outside Africa inherited approximately 1 to 2% of their DNA from Neanderthals. That percentage may seem insignificant, but across billions of people, it represents an enormous genetic legacy. In fact, while no single person carries more than a small fraction of Neanderthal DNA, scientists estimate that nearly 40% of the Neanderthal genome survives collectively across living human populations. In other words, although Neanderthals no longer exist as a distinct people, much of their genetic blueprint still exists distributed among us. The implications reached far beyond archaeology. For the first time, scientists could prove that two human populations once thought to be completely separate had not only met, but produced children whose descendants are alive today. Somewhere in the valleys of Ice Age Eurasia, relationships formed between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Those relationships were not isolated accidents. They happened often enough to leave a measurable genetic signature that has survived for tens of thousands of years. It is one of the most intimate discoveries ever made about our prehistoric past. Human evolution was not a straight line. It was a story of migration, contact, adaptation, and, at times, family. That revelation also forced scientists to reconsider how they define a species. Traditionally, biology teaches that separate species cannot produce fertile offspring. Horses and donkeys produce mules, but mules are generally infertile. The descendants of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, however, clearly continued reproducing because their DNA remains present today. Some researchers argue that this suggests Neanderthals were less a completely separate species and more a closely related human population. Others maintain that the long period of independent evolution justifies keeping them as a distinct species. The debate continues, reminding us that nature rarely fits neatly into human categories. The genome also revealed something even more surprising. Neanderthal DNA is not simply an ancient relic sitting quietly inside our chromosomes. Some of those inherited genes remain biologically active today. Researchers have identified Neanderthal-derived genetic variants that appear to influence aspects of the immune system, helping early modern humans adapt to unfamiliar diseases after leaving Africa. Other inherited variants are associated with skin and hair characteristics that may have been advantageous in colder northern climates. Certain studies have linked Neanderthal DNA to differences in pain sensitivity, sleep patterns, metabolism, and the body's response to sunlight. It is important, however, to understand what these findings actually mean. They do not suggest that people with Neanderthal DNA are fundamentally different from anyone else, nor do they imply that inherited Neanderthal genes determine personality, intelligence, or destiny. Human biology is extraordinarily complex. Thousands of genes interact with one another while environment, nutrition, lifestyle, and chance all shape the final outcome. Most modern genetic studies identify statistical associations rather than direct causes. As new research emerges, many early conclusions are refined or revised. That is how science progresses. What cannot be disputed is that ancient DNA has transformed our understanding of human history. Before the rise of paleogenomics, archaeologists relied almost entirely on fossils, stone tools, and burial sites to reconstruct the past. Those discoveries remain invaluable, but DNA has added an entirely new dimension. It can reveal migrations invisible in the archaeological record, identify relationships between ancient populations, and even uncover encounters that left behind no written history and few physical traces. A fragment of bone no larger than a fingernail can now answer questions that once seemed impossible. Much of this scientific revolution is credited to the work of Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo, whose determination transformed an impossible dream into an entirely new field of research. For years, many believed ancient DNA simply could not survive long enough to be useful. Pääbo proved otherwise. His pioneering techniques made it possible to recover, sequence, and compare the genomes of extinct humans with those of living people. In recognition of those achievements, he was awarded the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. It was not merely an award for decoding an ancient genome. It was recognition that our understanding of human evolution had fundamentally changed. Yet the more scientists learned, the more one question refused to disappear. If Neanderthals were intelligent, if they adapted successfully to Europe for almost 400,000 years,